So last week, we got a question from a viewer whose name is Comparative Reasoning. I assume Mr. and Mrs. Reasoning named them comparative after great-grandpa Comparative Reasoning the first or something. And what they say is, I've noticed over the years that the media has become highly right-wing interested. I've noticed how they won't cover progressive candidates. Case in point, 2016 CNN interviewed Bernie Sanders, primarily asking him questions about Hillary. So there's a lot going on in terms of claims of right-wing bias in the media, and at the risk of being repetitive, I'm going to come back to some of this stuff. And just to give people who don't know me some idea of my background, I've worked at ABC News, CNN, MSNBC, Comedy Central for a while. I worked at UPI, one of the wire services. So I've been at a bunch of these places, and I don't mean to disappoint anyone, but I've never encountered sort of open systemic political bias. That said, there are other biases that shape our media, and so I want to talk about them just a little bit. One, of course, is the bias for conflict, right? It's a lot easier to talk about a fight than it is to talk about an agreement. So where you have bills, for instance, that have broad bipartisan backing, there's no fight to cover. And so there's no coverage, or often there's no coverage. Climate change is being ignored from a legislative standpoint. If anything, measures to fight it are being rolled back, but there's no ongoing daily conflict over it. And so it doesn't get covered as much. And I tend to think, I could be wrong, but I tend to think that lately, it didn't used to be this way, but lately, Democrats are more likely to fracture over legislative measures than Republicans are. We've seen pretty open obstruction on the part of Republicans, and to some extent a pride about it, certainly under President Obama. This was a point of pride. We're not going to help President Obama get anything done. Democrats, on the other hand, you tend to have folks like Joe Manchin who say, and this is, I think, not an unreasonable position to take, when I can do something good by working with President Trump or the Republicans in Congress, I'm going to do that in order to do something good. What that does is it gives some of these measures that are primarily backed on the right, it gives them an imprimatur of bipartisanship that measures from the left seldom get. So right there, you've got a structural bias against covering measures from the left, because there's bipartisan consensus against them, and so they don't ever rise to the level of a fight because it's an intra-party fight. It's not a Republican-Democratic fight. The progressives on the left aren't able to get to be unified as often. So you do tend to find it much more often when the conflict is between Republicans solidly amassed and Democrats solidly amassed. And one other thing I'll say is that I do think there is some fairness to the claim, and I'm going to caveat this, so let's not quote me out of context here. The idea that there is a bias among the media broadly towards the left on some policies. So for instance, you're probably, maybe this isn't quite as true lately, but you're probably much more likely to find that members of the media, people who work in the national media, are generally speaking more supportive of gay rights, LGBTQ rights, than perhaps the population more broadly. The fallacy here, though, is in thinking that translates into a bias toward the left in coverage. In my experience, it works the other way around, okay? And here's what I mean by that. Let's say I'm a reporter or a producer, right, at one of the national networks that's not Fox, whether we're talking about cable or broadcast networks. And I'm looking at covering a specific story or a specific issue, I tend to think of myself as probably a Democrat or maybe even a progressive, and so I'm not envisioning the possibility, the prospect that there are views, substantive, serious views shared by a significant portion of the American people to my left. In other words, my involvement sort of checks the box of the left. And now, for balance, I've got to go out and I've got to book a conservative to talk about it. And now I'm done. But in the process, all I've done is give a conservative a voice because I've internalized this notion that I'm biased rather than thinking, you know what, let's keep me out of it. My obligation as a producer is to find credible voices across the spectrum, and certainly the notion of what's a credible voice and is it really there are two sides to every story as opposed to 10 sides or whatever. Those are other issues that I don't want to belabor too much. So I do think there is something to the idea that there is a right-wing bias in the content that comes out, but I don't think it's necessarily intentional, and I tend to think it's more a function of a combination of systemic problems as well as the right's, I would say, sort of superior ability to game those problems, right? The right will gang up and cry victim, I think, or call out bias a lot more effectively than the left will. I think whether it's because the left has sort of maybe a more vigorous respect for the institution of the press and the need for an adversarial dialogue, so maybe the left isn't quite as forceful when it comes to beating up on the media. I'm not entirely sure about that, but so the bottom line is there bias there in terms of the way things get covered? I think that's true to some extent, but I don't think it's conscious or malevolent or anything like that. And I should give a shout out to Chris Cuomo at CNN, who's recently put my boss, Cenk Uygur, on the air and had good conversations as a result. So I think hopefully we may not have the fairness doctrine anymore, and you should look that up if you're not familiar with it. But we may not have the fairness doctrine anymore, but hopefully marketplace forces and the need to compete will start, and maybe to some extent TYT's success will wake up mainstream media's need to put more progressive voices on, grapple more aggressively with progressive ideas, especially given polling that shows that they're held by broad swaths of the American people. So that said, I'm going to shut up and see if you guys have questions, because I did kind of promise to AMA this a little bit. Okay. Adrian can hear me. Dave says I'm good. Thank you, guys. John Stade-Rapaski says, is there a way to know beforehand if the DNC is leaking debate questions to candidates? Yeah, there is. And that's if that's leaked to reporters. So if you're in the DNC and you know about candidates, questions being leaked to candidates, leak that to me. We're at theyoungturks@protonmail.com. So is there an official way? I don't mean to be flip, John, but is there an official way to know that? Not really. It's not. The DNC is not subject to freedom of information laws, and journalists don't have subpoena power, so we can't find that out. But I would also say that to some extent, we also need, I think, to work on what we pay attention to. And if one person in the DNC shares one question with one member of one campaign on one debate, it's very tempting to jump on that chain as evidence of institutional systemic corruption and all of that. But it's worth calling it out, but that sort of gotcha mentality, I think, gets us chasing our tail is the wrong term, but it gets us on a road to just looking for evidence of cheating and putting thumbs on the scale and all that stuff, when I think the real effective work is achieved by collective organizing and elevating issues and rewarding and incentivizing candidates for responding to and grappling with those issues. So I think those things are important, but we have more power than we typically exercise, especially if we don't get consumed by using these sort of paper trails as cherry picking those incidents as evidence of some big broad scheme or corruption or conspiracy, for what it's worth. Okay, let's do a few more here. The corporate media is only there to set a narrow narrative and be stenographers for power. That's from A Dingo Ate Me Baby. So no one likes this answer, but having worked in corporate media for 15-something years, that's not how anyone there thinks. No one except the fine professionals who actually are professional stenographers. No one likes to think of themselves as a stenographer. So I think it's important to sort of set aside those notions that, they just do what their masters tell them, and try to grapple with the fact that there are other reasons, there are other institutional reasons and systemic reasons why we get the media we do. And don't get me wrong, the fact that it's a corporation does have some impact, but in my experience, the one thing that everyone talks about is the profit motive as being destructive. I actually, in my own experience, I've found myself thinking, I wish the profit motive were more active and were more of a factor in decision making. And to me, some of the most toxic elements of the corporate culture have been things that I think are anathema to journalism, right? The idea that you need to create a space where you can not only open the floor to ideas, but also challenge ideas. And sometimes that's a painful process. People don't like, right? If everyone has to agree and feel good about the way you're pitching a story, then you end up with lowest common denominator stories. Ooh, that's interesting, right? Check, and that's it. If, on the other hand, someone pitches something that's a difficult story to tell, like global warming, let's say there's no peg for global warming today, and you pitch an unusual way of telling it, the people who have to execute that, they might justifiably not be confident in their ability to execute on that, so they may push back. And if you then push back on them, now you've got conflict, and corporations with their HR departments do not like conflict. And so there's a natural kind of settling of your content matter to lowest common denominator. Yeah, that's interesting. That's cool. And that also applies to telling news stories, right? If it's new, then someone has to make an affirmative case for telling that story. If it's something that's already been pre-sold as news because Trump tweeted about it, or the New York Times and the Washington Post are writing about it, then everyone goes, okay, yeah, that's the story, and we can tell it. The DNC said in a fraud lawsuit, it does not have to be fair. It can select its own candidate as a private entity. Okay. What are your thoughts on the corporate media pushing Elizabeth Warren as being more palatable than Bernie Sanders and pitting them against each other? So that's from Jason House. I hope I'm saying your name correctly, Jason. So when we talk about corporate media pushing things, again, I think very few people who actually work in the media think of themselves as pushing anything. What tends to happen is they think, this is interesting. And so if there's an uptick in buzz around Elizabeth Warren, this is interesting. And so let's talk about it. And that's seen as pushing her, when more likely what it is they're interested in her and the narratives that come around her, the most obvious of which being that she occupies similar territory with Bernie Sanders and therefore could be seen as an electoral political threat to the position he has occupied in the party for the last few years. So when we talk about pitting them against each other, it's not necessarily, I think, that producers out there are thinking, oh, I want Warren to take out Sanders, or I want them to fight. It's more that they look at the dynamics and they perceive, not wrongly, a potential conflict there. And as I said earlier, there is a bias towards conflict. And so we get an undue amount of attention being paid to areas where you can identify and talk about a conflict, right? And that lets you avoid talking about policy, right? So if there were only Bernie Sanders, someone mentioned earlier the idea that they weren't asking Bernie Sanders about policy. I will let you in on a dirty little secret about asking a politician about policy. It's hard. You risk looking like you don't know what you're talking about, especially if you don't know what you're talking about. And it's very hard as a generalist at the level who has access to these candidates to be schooled well enough in a particular policy to acquit yourself well. It's so much easier, and you should understand, everyone should understand this on a human level. It's so much easier to ask questions like, do you think you're going to do well against Elizabeth Warren, right? Or do you expect to go negative against Elizabeth Warren than it is to say, to dive deep on where she stands on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, right? Because you don't know what to do with the follow-up because you're not well schooled on the CFPB. So again, a bias does emerge, but the bias is less against specific policies than it is about the notion of policy for the not politically biased reason that policy is hard. So at least, again, that's my take. Adrian says, Ken is the man and doing a great job. Thanks for creating these videos. Can we go fund me, you guys, to investigate a topic? Well, thank you, Adrian. Ken is definitely the man, and he's definitely doing a great job. And as I mentioned earlier, I like to get Ken on these on Mondays, so I hope you'll subscribe and check us out. And Ken and I will try to make sure that he and I do a Skype call on his reporting or some other area that we think merits sort of a shared discussion on Monday. In terms of doing a GoFundMe, you can certainly go to tyt.com/join if you want to support what we're doing, and that would be great. And you become a member, and you get all kinds of behind-the-scenes stuff and ancillary content that only members get. In terms of asking us to investigate a topic, I hope the guys in accounting don't get mad at me for this, but you don't have to pay for that. You can tell us about it. As I said earlier, you can send us tips at theyoungturks@protonmail.com. That's if you want to use Proton Mail and have a secure line. But I will say that, but you can also if you've got an idea for something you think we should investigate, you can just put it in the comments or the chat. 95% of people who make story suggestions to us are generally disappointed by the response, and I'll explain why. 95% of people are not revealing or offering to share with us information that isn't already known. Almost always what people are saying is, this is a bad thing, please talk about it and draw attention to it. And that's what TYT is all about, right? But that's not what TYT Investigates is all about. Our platform at TYT Investigates isn't big enough because not enough of you guys subscribe to us for us to be able to drive the conversation here at TYT Investigates. TYT, maybe. Us, not quite yet. But the point is that we're journalists and reporters. We're not amplifiers. Despite me occasionally weighing in on TYTI Daily, I'm not a pundit. I'm primarily a managing editor and reporter. So most of the story ideas we get actually aren't story ideas. They're like jukebox requests. It's like, play this song, play this song. And I feel bad because we end up disappointing people, but that's not what we do. We're in the business of investigating when there is credible reason to think that there is something that matters, that isn't yet known, that we have a shot at learning and revealing and sharing with people. I hope that addresses that. Oh, I got Jason House's name correctly. Thank you, Jason. Are there not research departments at mainstream media? That's from A Dingo Ate Me Baby. So, yeah, typically there are. I'm not sure exactly what's underlying why you asked that question in terms of research departments, but in my experience, they're pretty seldom used, and they serve potentially two functions. One, of course, is what we think of as traditional research. You know, how did Lyndon Johnson vote on whatever back in 1958? You know, whatever it might be. But honestly, there's Google these days for that. I suspect that these days, mostly what the research departments are used for is finding archival video. But the reality is that most TV news is not produced with an eye towards research, because research is generally useful to provide context, and context provision is not generally something we get from day of air news gathering and reporting. So there's not a whole lot of use for it. And when the research department is used, it tends to be used for things like, we're preparing a bio in case Phyllis Diller dies, so we need to pull some research together, that kind of thing. Or if, for instance, the Pope is going to Sao Paulo or something, you would put together a briefing book, right? Give the people anchoring it, you give them a packet of research, and that way they have it on hand so they can, let's be honest, fill the time while you're waiting for the Pope, that kind of thing. I think I'm going to wrap this up. Corporate media hardly, so this will be my last one, but again, we do this every Friday. I love that you guys are asking these questions. It's a lot of fun for me. As you can tell, I can go on about this stuff forever, but I do think it's important that we generally, as a people, have a conversation about what our journalists do, why, and how. So last question, Billy Cool, really cool, says, also, corp media hardly ever does investigative reporting. If it bleeds, it leads, or talking heads making noise. So that's roughly on target, I think. But, and here again, I want to draw on my own experience. So the corporate media, the big ones, they generally actually have investigative units. What tends to happen, though, is that you've got your investigative unit over here, and then you've got your programming unit over here. And within your programming, you've got individual shows. And it's not that there's a formal firewall in between them. It's just that there's no communication. So what might happen is the investigative unit spends, there are two scenarios where the investigative unit comes into play. One is when they've taken the initiative and they've come up with a story, then they'll let the shows know, we're breaking a story, and whoever it is, the on-air person, is available to talk about it. And then each show will make a decision, will we talk about this story today? And that tends to be it. There's no strategic thought given generally, other than, we'll put this story on our morning show and on the evening news, and in maybe an expanded version in the evening magazine. That's generally the extent of it. What they don't tend to do is treat those stories with the same kind of serial, S-E-R-I-A-L, serial potential that the ongoing political dramas have. And so those stories, they kind of pop up and then they disappear because they're not embraced at the show level the same way that stories broken by other outlets are, right? That have that stamp of approval of the New York Times or the Washington Post. So they do have investigative reporting, but it tends to surface and then disappear. The one other scenario in which it tends to come to play is, let's say there's a terrorist attack. Then the investigative unit will often kind of set aside what they're working on and see what they can dig up on the suspect or the target or recent threats or FBI leads, that kind of thing. So they'll kind of work the phones and funnel that material to the shows in their silo, and then those shows will either use it or not. And so that's our AMA for today, and I'm not going to go on any longer just to spare you guys the agony. But if there are additional questions, pop them in the comments, or even better, save them for next Friday, and we'll do this again next Friday. If you subscribe on YouTube and also on TYT.com, TYT Investigates, you can find us on Facebook, where we also post the articles, our reporting, Ken's great reporting, my reporting. We post those pieces there as well as other videos. So I hope you'll follow us and like us on Facebook, subscribe here on YouTube, and I also hope you'll have a great weekend and be good to each other.